Ever since we entered the Playtime factory in chapter 1, this place seemed pretty big, but then in chapter 2, when we go underground into the game station, it seems even bigger. But then in chapter 3, we take a literal gondola type train station into this giant sphere that's probably worth more than the Las Vegas sphere. But it gets even crazier because in chapter 4, we take another elevator down to the prison and then eventually fall down into the labs, which could be who knows how big. So let's go over just how big Playtime really is. In the beginning of chapter 1, we enter what seemed to be the main entrance, as on the chapter 1 title screen we can see a view of what seems to be the entire factory. The first room that you enter seems to be a small entrance with a concierge desk, and to the right there's a gift shop with toy Huggies and Boogie Bots, but to the left there's a security room with monitors to watch over the factory, where we then find a grab pack in the wall. But then when using that grab pack to enter the main lobby, we see even more rooms for people to enter. For example, testing, innovation, and even a theater, which might be a movie theater, but it would most likely be playing videos that Playtime made, probably documentaries about the company and the toys as part of their factory tours that we see in the very first tape before chapter 1 even starts. However, if you notice this giant dome-like ceiling above Huggy, we can look at the loading screen and see the exact dome in the photo. But the thing is, when you look around the dome in game, you can't see the bigger part of the factory behind it. So this photo might be a plan for what the factory was supposed to look like, or it's possible that they just forgot to add this in game and only left the sky in for better lighting behind Huggy. But then we go deeper into the factory after fixing the power and make it into what seems to be a shipping room, where we then eventually make it to the Make a Toy room, which is honestly massive by itself. Then after a chase in the vents, we finally make it to the biggest room in chapter 1, with very high up catwalks that are over what seem to be hundreds of feet of literal void, which makes zero sense because this would cost a lot of money to make. So why waste so much space if you're just gonna put a few catwalks that don't really do much? But it gets even crazier in chapter 2, because once we free Poppy from her case, she's eventually kidnapped and we're forced to fall down this giant hole in the ground. But the thing is, there were multiple slides coming down to the game station, one for each of the higher ups at Playtime where some people theorized that this fifth slide with its letters on the ground could be the player. However, because Harley Sawyer didn't recognize us in chapter 4, it seems to be that we weren't a higher up. But then again, Miss Delight and Mommy Longlegs both recognized us, with Mommy Longlegs working in the game station and Miss Delight working in the school, two very different locations. So if they both knew that we were an employee, then it's possible that we used to be a higher up, and in reality Sawyer just didn't care about us because he was busy working in the labs. But then when we see the game station, it is absolutely massive, and so in my opinion it seems that this wasn't just used for the orphans who lived in Playcare, as this would be a ton of money just for that, but instead this could have been an attraction that Playtime used to bring people to their factory, either to do factory tours or just charge them to use the game station. For example, if you were a parent, you could have brought your kid and his friends here, either for his birthday or any other special event, which would then help Playtime to pay for the construction costs. But then we see at the end of chapter 2 a literal train that takes you throughout the factory, where the one path that we're trying to take probably leads you outside, or at least close to outside, and the other track leading you much deeper to Playcare, or at least that's the sign that we saw right before we passed out in the end of chapter 2. But then in chapter 3, we're put into a trash compactor by Catnap, and we're forced to escape through a series of puzzles, which honestly, these rooms are huge in and of themselves until we finally make it down to Playcare. And this thing, bro, is absolutely huge. When we make it down the gondola, we see that we're literally going through cave systems, and once we get close enough, we can see that we're entering a giant dome, almost like the Las Vegas sphere, which is where all the kids in Playcare were kept. But this was built underground, probably so that the orphans wouldn't be as easy to find when they went missing and got turned into experiments, which would also make Playtime Co. not be discovered by the police. But also inside of Playcare, we see multiple buildings, and only some of which we get to go inside, like the counselor's office, the school, and Home Sweet Home. And I don't know why, but the counselor's office seems to be the biggest out of all the buildings, even though it doesn't seem like there would be more counselors than kids. However, because Home Sweet Home seems to have a giant basement, it's likely that Home Sweet Home is bigger than the counselor's office, because if they want to house that many orphans, they're gonna need a ton of beds. But then in the end of chapter 3, we managed to still go deeper into the factory by taking an elevator, which is next to the gas production zone. But before we actually make it all the way down, Kissy was attacked, leading to Poppy going back up to try and help her, and we're left to wander around all by ourselves. And considering we fell down like 100-200 feet back in chapter 2, we had to go down in the Playcare by a train car, and now we went down another elevator that went down, I don't know, another 300 or 400 feet, and you can see that Playtime Co. had a massive cave system on their hands, in which they could build pretty much whatever they wanted. And so we begin to explore and eventually come to this massive room filled with thousands of different toy bodies. But after this, we find the prison, where we can see that they had multiple prison blocks, with at least 4 or 5 of them being in use, which must have taken so much money to build, bro, it's crazy. But then after the prison, we see what's called Safe Haven, which wasn't even named by the toys, but by Playtime Co., as they built it for some kind of panic room in case the toys would escape. Then another absolutely massive room is the doughy boss fight room, but it also seems to be the only entrance that'll lead you to the labs. However, we only make it to the labs because the prototype blew us up, so it's possible that there's another entrance. But after killing Doughy, we go down a hallway, slide down into the ventilation block, where we're then blown up even deeper into the factory, where we finally get to what seems to be the absolute last stop in Playtime Co., which is where we're then locked inside with Huggy banging on the door. But then again, we don't even know how big the labs are. It's possible that although everything else is big, maybe the labs are the absolute biggest thing that Playtime Co. has created. Because if they've created all the other things, like the prison block for housing all the experiments, then how big could the labs be if that's where they're creating the very experiments that they're housing in the prison? We know that there have been about 1,400 different experiments, and although it seems like not all of them were made in the labs, a decent chunk of them had to be. And so with all of this being said, we can see that Playtime Co. is absolutely massive. But because of the chapter 2 documentary about Elliot Ludwig, it makes sense why this place is so big. He was literally called the king of the toy industry, and since toys are a huge business, he was most likely worth a few $billion. And so with Playtime Co. being this huge, who knows what in the world we'll end up seeing in chapter 5. But what do you guys think? Let me know down in the comments. Thanks for watching, subscribe, and click on this video right here.